When I was growing up, Blockbuster was a name that just pretty much everyone knew. I mean, if you watched movies, if you were interested in Hollywood or even anything, you had been to that store. And if you wanted a movie, the way you did it was you rented it from a store. They had these things called cassette tapes, eventually what became DVDs. I know none of us have heard of those in here. But I was always excited as a boy. It was something we did as a family. A new movie would come out. I could never sleep that night. And, we would kind of dream about it, wrestle around, and my dad would get us to the Blockbuster store, and we'd just be waiting for the doors to open so that we could get to the back and get a copy of that movie before it ran out. Because you know what happened when they ran out? You'd be waiting. You'd get on the waiting list. Blockbuster was an incredibly successful company, especially at their peak around the year 2000. They had over 9,000 stores. They served over 65 million people across the globe. They were bringing in roughly around $6 billion in revenue each year. They were an incredible success. They had a monopoly over the movie industry. But around the turn of the century, this was also when technology began to change in the movie industry. There was a new kid on the block, a new entrepreneur company. They called themselves Netflix. They opened their doors in August of 1997. The young company began pitching some new models for viewers, and young viewers attached to them pretty quickly. The first one was that you could now order a DVD online and have it mailed to your house. What an innovative idea that Netflix was bringing out. You didn't have to go to the store and rent movies. Not too long from there, Netflix thought of another idea. They found ways to begin streaming movies across the internet. It was an incredible and ingenious method. Blockbuster wasn't too worried, though. They had faced challenges like Netflix in the past. They had, their success, their model had always served them well in the past, and they were confident that this store model that they had developed over decades would continue to be successful, even if Netflix did take a portion of their business. They didn't take them too seriously. Well, today, Blockbuster has only one store left. It's located in Bend, Oregon. And it quite literally is a relic of the past. Blockbuster thought they could overcome any challenge. They thought that they could never lose. That success that they had had for all those years had taught them they were going to be winners forever. Sometimes that's our problem too. You watch God work so much in your life and through your ministry that you get to this place where you think you could never fail. Keith was one of my success stories. When I was much younger, I was a camp counselor there down in Delray Beach, Florida, where I was born and raised. Keith was a camper that I worked with year after year as I would go back home in the summers. I watched God work through this young man's life. He had been in and out of foster homes pretty much all of his life. And I watched as I would go home and I would visit with his foster parents. We'd spend time at his house. He was my camper. And I'd pray for Keith and disciple him as I was there. And I watched as this young man became a faithful member of the youth group there in the church. And from that point on, watching him grow and become the man of God that he is today. I think also of another young man, I'll call him Jack, just in case he ever watches this video. This young man, I had been living out of state, and I was attending a church. A gentleman and we became pretty good friends. He found out that I was from South Florida and that I had a church down there, and he told me about an extended relative of his. He'd been praying for this young man that he'd get saved, and we began to pray together. And I called my pastor down there in southern Florida, and we all began to shake heaven as this pastor of mine, he went over and he met this young man. He had a daughter out of wedlock, and they brought the family to church. And I eventually would move back down south, and I became friends with Jack. And we're still friends today. And I watched as God began to change him and to shape him and to mold him. And after 15 years, he's still in that church. And there are other stories like that, times when I watched God move and change lives. But there are just as many times when I remember, I did just everything right. And yet, somehow you hit a wall. I've worked on sermons before where, I thought, wow, some people are going to get saved and things are going to just happen. And nobody cared. People were sleeping on the back row. Nobody was impressed with anything. I thought, what's happening? I did everything just right. Why aren't you seeing God's power at work? I'm working on some doctoral work right now there at Southwestern, and there have been times that played out just like that. I work on one project, and man, I was so encouraged by the results. The teacher loved the paper. The students, they got the message of it, and they understood, and man, they were all just so blessed by all my efforts. And then there were other times, when you work just as hard and you just feel like, wow, man, this is going to be the most incredible seminar as you walk in and they sit there. The teacher wasn't impressed. The students didn't care. The paper was a flop. And you ask yourself, what gives? Maybe it's a past job for some of you. You've worked hard and to be successful. You've done it before. You prepare everything. You work so hard to impress the boss. You come in on the weekends. You're willing to work overtime. And all of your extra efforts, the presentations that you've developed, the ideas that you've brought to the business, it's always served you well in the past. But this time, it doesn't seem to be working. This time, the boss passes you up. Maybe it's the kids or the grandkids. You've raised children. You know how to do it. You've read all the Dobson books. You know what to do when the child misbehaves. And those methods have served you well in the past. You've raised godly kids. But this time, the kid, he's not a kid anymore. He's a teenager. And this time, the struggle, the ideas, the things that you've used in the past, they're not working. This happens in marriages all the time. A couple, they've been together for years, right? And they love each other. But we all have our disagreements. Just ask my wife. But you've always been able to work through those disagreements in the past. She makes him dinner. He buys her flowers. And, you make up. Only this time it's different. This time, he doesn't care about the dinner. This time, the flowers you give her, the gifts you bring, that makes things worse. And you begin to ask yourself, why isn't it working this time? It worked before. What's going on? Why isn't what I did last time working in this situation? That question that we ask ourselves time and again, it's the same question Jesus' disciples were asking them in the text we're going to look at today. In our story, we're going to see Jesus' disciples come face to face with a challenge, one they've faced many times before. Only this time, they failed to live up to the challenge. Turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. Mark 9. Jesus, he's with Peter, James, and John. And these disciples with their Lord, they're having an exhilarating experience, seeing this transfiguration of Jesus before their eyes on the top of the mountain. They're in the first part of the chapter. But as they're with Jesus and he's teaching them things that are to come, a crowd is gathering below the mountain. A father had brought his demonic child to the disciples. He was looking for Jesus. He'd heard about the Lord and the miracles that he'd done. He stands in front of the disciples and he asks them to cast out his son. He said, I've come looking for someone named Jesus. Now, I can see that he's not here right now. Maybe you can help me. Is there anything you can do for my son? Well, certainly they could do it. These disciples, they've faced situations like this in the past. You know, when they first started walking with the Lord, he taught them and showed them how to cast out demons in Mark 3. And then a few months ago, Jesus had actually sent them out in pairs. And they had gone out on a mission, on a preaching tour. And during that time, the disciples had cast out many demons there in Mark 6. And they knew how to do it, and they were certainly willing to help. They put their hands on the boy, and they commanded the demon to come out of him. And they lay their hands on him, and they begin to... Nothing happens. They try it again. And again. Nothing. They spoke louder. They shook the boy. Nothing. After several minutes of this, the disciples are at a loss. They don't know what's happening. It's worked before. Why can't they cast the demon out? Why is this time different? How comes nothing is happening this time? After several minutes of failure, these disciples, they're puzzled. The father, he's discouraged. The religious leaders and the scribes, of course, they're excited. They've proved their point. They begin pointing fingers at the disciples. We knew it. We knew it. It's all a fraud. He's a fake. We knew that this master wasn't who he claimed to be. If he were, you would have had his power to do this. They're laughing and arguing as the Lord and the three disciples descend from the mountain. Jesus approaches this crowd and all the hustling and bustling there. Centered down and hunkered down right in the center of it all are the disciples. Read with me verses 14 and 15. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him and saluted him. Jesus, he looks around and he asks in verse 16, the scribes, what question ye with them? The Father steps forward out of the crowd. And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. Verse 18, and whithersoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. So that's what's going on here. The disciples, they couldn't cast out the demon. Jesus, you can imagine his frustration as he gazes over the crowd. How long do I need to be with you? Jesus says, how many times do I have to work a miracle before your eyes before you come to realize that God can do anything? He says, how long, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Jesus, though, he's talking to everyone. He's not just looking at the scribes. He's not just staring at the Father. He's gazing at his disciples. He sees the whole multitude before him. And he points to them. He says, O faithful generation, how long shall I be with you? What must I do before you bring your problems to me? How long do I have to do wonders among you before you remember there's nothing too hard for God? In verse 19, he says, bring him to me. The father drags his son to Jesus, kicking and screaming. And as soon as the boy sees the Lord, the child begins to have a seizure. Froth begins to pour down his neck. He throws himself into the dirt. He's shaking. What would you do if you saw that? We read, and they brought him unto him. And when he saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell onto the ground and wallowed foaming. Jesus looks at the boy. He looks at the Father, and in compassion, he asks him, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. Can you imagine the burden that this father's been bearing? Probably all of the boy's life. And the suicidal tendency that the demon had brought into this child's life. It says, and oftentimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Lord, if there's anything you can do, I'm begging you, please, help my son. I brought him to your disciples. They couldn't do anything. But Jesus, can you help? The Lord is so, I love the way Jesus works. He cleverly turns it around on him. Instead of answering the question, Jesus, can you do anything? His response is simply this: if you can believe. He says, anything is possible to those who trust God. If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. Jesus, he's not saying that the Father, if he just has faith, the Father can do anything. No, Jesus is saying that there is a God in heaven, and he says that there is a God in heaven who can do anything. A God who will do anything for anyone who believes in him. He says all things are possible to him who believes. Amen. You know, the Father, I love this part of the story because he gets it. The Father, he's really the foil in the story to the disciples. He says, Lord, I do believe. He says, Jesus, I do believe God can do anything. And I have doubts, but Lord, I believe you can heal my son. Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief. And yet, when he brings his son to Jesus in faith, even with his doubts, Jesus, in compassion, heals his son. We see in verse 25 through 27, when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him. And he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And I think as you're reading that, you're like, wow, what an incredible ending to an incredible story. I mean, at least for the Father and the Son, right? I mean, even in his doubts, when the Father brings his son to Jesus, Jesus, as he always does, he has compassion and he heals them both. And friend, that's the first thing this story shows us. When you're reading through this passage, when you come face to face with a situation that is beyond your control, believe that God can do anything. There's nothing too hard for the Lord.
That's right.
But you know, the thing is, the disciples, they believed that. I mean, they had seen what God can do, right? He had worked through them in the past. He had already given them power to cast out demons before. They knew God could do anything. They knew there was nothing too hard for the Lord. We believe that too. We know God can do anything. He's done things through us in the past. God has done so many things in my ministry throughout my walk with the Lord. I've been so excited to see the things that God's already done in the life of my family, in my marriage. I've seen God work. I've seen God work in the life of my kids. I know God can do anything. There's nothing too hard for the Lord. But why was this time so different? That question finally comes to bear in the last scene of our story. It's the part that concerns the disciples. And the rest of the story is the part that concerns us. Here, the disciples and Jesus, they're alone. And now is their chance to ask the question that's been nagging at them all day. And when he was come unto the house, his disciples asked him privately, Jesus, why could not we cast him out? We've cast out demons before. Lord, why couldn't we do what we did before? It's the same question we face time and again. You know, the family's falling apart, and you've done everything you can, and you can't figure out how to stop it. The kids won't listen to you. Your wife, she doesn't want to hear it. The pastor, he preaches week after week. He's tried a new worship style. He's done everything he could. He's worked and worked. He's knocked doors, changed all sorts of things, trying to figure out, and yet the church isn't growing. Your family business, it's still falling apart. You know, you've worked hard. You've taken advice from everyone in town, and yet it still seems as though the company is dying, and it will soon go bankrupt. Why can't we overcome these situations? The same kind of situations that we face time and again in our lives. This is Jesus' answer. He says, and he said unto them, this kind come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. There are two parts to Jesus' answer to the disciples. The first, he says, we need to recognize that we can't do what we did before because we're facing a situation that we haven't faced before. Notice he says here in the verse, he says, this kind. Jesus is saying here, there is a level of evil at work here. An evil that is different from the demonic, from the demons they had faced in the past. And so one reason they can't do what they did before, Jesus says, is they're facing an evil that they hadn't faced before. Something that they haven't encountered before. Maybe they've cast out demons before, and their methods have applied in the past. But this kind of demon, this kind of evil that they're facing, it's not like anything the disciples had seen up to now. Satan is working harder. He's brought something new to the fight. Well, the question becomes, how do you overcome that kind of a challenge, right? Well, that's the second part of Jesus' answer. He says one of the reasons you can't do what you did before is because the kind of evil you're facing is nothing like you faced before. But secondly, he says this, that some kinds of evil are overcome only through prayer. You know, it's the first time Jesus mentions prayer in our story today. Up to now, he's been focusing on their unbelief. If you had read earlier, you saw that he rebuked the disciples, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the whole crowd for their faithlessness. And it was the Father's faith that brought his son healing. Faith brought the Father to ask Jesus, even with doubts. It was his faith that brought him to ask Jesus and the disciples for help. But by moving the discussion from faith to prayer, what Jesus is doing is he's linking faith and prayer together. And he's saying that, hey, when we're facing situations that are beyond our control, we need to pray. And the reason is because when we're praying, we're relying on God and not ourselves. Amen. It's how the disciples had succeeded before. You remember, their eyes were on God. When they cast out demons throughout Galilee in the past, they knew that God was doing the work through them. They lived a life of faith by prayer. They recognized, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12, that, hey, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. But you see, now the disciples had a lot of success. They'd begun relying on their past victories. The problem is that those successes had brought them to where they are in our text today. There was a famous saying by Albert Einstein. You see it sometimes written on plaques. Einstein said this. He said, you can't solve today's problems with yesterday's solutions. Sometimes our past successes become some of our greatest failures today if we start relying on those successes for the problems we're facing today. When you start looking back at all the victories that you've had and all the times when you saw God work, and you begin clinging to that victory in those times of God's power as a means to help you today. Just like Blockbuster, you start to see that it's a flop. But they weren't just relying on past successes. They didn't just become overconfident. The disciples, you can tell, had become pretty self-centered by the time you get to Mark 9. They were concerned with their image now. The disciples had started looking at themselves. If you doubt that, read the rest of Mark 9. In fact, skip with me to verse 33. After the disciples had been arguing on the road, in verse 33, and he came to Capernaum. And being in the house, Jesus, he asks them, what was it that you disputed among yourselves by the way? But they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. When you're not praying enough, when I'm not praying enough, that becomes our problem too. Hey, what are people going to think of me when I go to Windy Hill Baptist Church with my family this morning? What are they going to think of my wife? Will I be embarrassed in front of others because I have some disobedient children? Will I fail at work and be lowered in the eyes of others if the business is a flop? When we're not praying, we become the focus. We begin to worry about our own reputation, concerned about our own self-image. But friend, when our life is sustained and strengthened by prayer, the first thing that happens is we're no longer concerned about ourselves. We're looking to the struggles. We're looking to the situation. And we're trying to find a solution with God's help. And so Jesus, his answer to them and to us is that sometimes prayer is God's only answer. Sometimes prayer is the only way to face the spiritual battles that you're facing today. But understand something, Christian. As you're reading through this story, Jesus, he's not just talking about like a moment of prayer, right? I mean, read back in the text. You don't find Jesus ever stopping to have a prayer meeting as he casts out the demon. In fact, if you read earlier in the gospel, you're never going to find a time when the disciples, they sit down and they hunker down and they go into their prayer closet before they went on their preaching tour. Jesus is talking about a lifestyle of prayer. He's talking about ongoing prayer. He's talking about daily prayer. Jesus is talking about a time spent with God, one that is continuous and ongoing. And Jesus says to overcome these kinds of evils, we need to be praying for God's power. We need to be praying for God's grace. Hey, if my family is struggling, some of the struggles that I'm dealing with in my home are only going to be overcome by prayer. When was the last time you and your spouse had a time alone with prayer? When was the last time you got together and you began to ask God for his power and for his grace? If I want God's help in raising my kids or my grandkids, I can't wait until they're teenagers before I start talking to the Lord for his wisdom and for his guidance. I need to be proactive in my family. Hey, if I'm having a hard time at work, if I want God to bless the work of my hands, then I better be bringing that before his feet. In Psalm 90, Moses, in verse 17, he's asking the Lord to bless the work of his people. He says, establish thou the work of our hands upon us. Yea, the work of our hands establish thou it. His prayer was that the Lord would accept their work and establish it as having value. Friend, we need to pray. Because when we pray, we show that our absolute dependence is on God. And we recognize, as Jesus put it, that all things are possible to him who believes. All things are possible to the disciple who depends on God and not himself. Those words echo Paul in Philippians 4 when he says, hey, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And Paul knew that because he knew that he could do nothing alone. May we be a people of prayer, continually demonstrating our dependence in Windy Hill Baptist Church that is on the Lord.